Hello, everyone. I am Joshua Burke. I'm an associate professor of history at Smith College. And it's my pleasure to bring to you today Ori Ben Shalom, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History of Science at Harvard University. Ori's dissertation examines how physicians in the 18th century in Italy use historical research to study epidemic diseases. But today, what we want to talk about is a recent publication that comes out of his master's thesis that was completed several years ago for the Department of History for Tel Aviv University. So, Ori, with your permission, I'd just like to read the full citation. Is that right? So this year's Society for Italian Historical Studies committee has awarded the prize for an outstanding article on medieval or early modern Italian history to Ori Ben Shalom for his article, Public Health, Medicine, and Religious Reform in Carlo Borromeo's Milan. This was published in the 16th Century Journal, volume 55. In 2004. The committee identified this as a beautifully written work that uses groundbreaking archival research to challenge a lot of the stereotypes about various kinds of sort of binary divisions between medical and ecclesiastical care in the 16th century. The article illuminates Carlo Borromeo's interventions in the medical sphere in these kind of nuanced and complex ways, and I think reveals these tensions and points of contact between religion and medicine. And it shows how epidemics could represent these opportunities to reaffirm the authority of the church, as well as to purify an entire society, both from plague and from sin. Ben Shalom's work enriches our understanding not just of Borromeo's strategies, but of the intersections between these sort of networks of ecclesiastical power and medical expertise. And does this, I think, most interestingly, both in Milan, but has repercussions beyond that. So that's the full citation. Thank you so much for being willing to join us for this interview.
And no, thank you for hosting me, and thank you for this lovely introduction.
Yeah. So I want to know a little bit more about sort of your process of coming to the topic of this article so we can sort of introduce our audience here to it.
Yeah, so I've started working on Carlo Borromeo's Milan quite a long time ago. I remember when I was a young master student, and I was interested actually in something entirely different. I was interested in masculinity in the age of the Counter-Reformation. And my advisor, Professor Tamar Herzig, and my advisor back then told me, you should really look at like this guy, Carlo Borromeo. It was pretty interesting. And I started like digging into it, and I came across his conduct during the plague years of 1576, 1577. And I started reading about it. And what caught my attention was that for him, the moment of plague was one of the most significant ways to advance his religious and political reform. So now, maybe some people know that, but just for the sake of the introduction of the figure of Carlo Borromeo,
Yeah.
Carlo Borromeo is a sort of like the poster boy of the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was the movement of church renewal that emerged in response to the Lutheran and Protestant Reformation, but it also advanced not only measures to protect Catholicism from the threat of Protestantism, but also envision these sort of like processes of renewal within the Catholic Church themselves. And Borromeo was a very important figure within that movement. He was the Milanese archbishop between 1564 to until his death in 1584. And he became known for his vast reforms that attempted to subjugate almost every aspect of human life under the authority of the church. Now, that means that Borromeo advocated um, for quite strict social disciplining measures that would allow his flock to become as pious as he imagined, as pious as a Christian could be. And his actions during those years actually made him a model for what archbishop should be doing in the age of the Counter-Reformation, and he was also the first figure of the Counter-Reformation to become canonized as a saint in 1610. So he's extremely important figure. So what I learned is that his actions during the plague were extremely important for the Reformation, for the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. But the way it did so was by opposing very opposing in different ways the secular authorities and the way they believed the plague should be managed. And I thought, oh, that's interesting that we have this divide between a
Right.
religious leader who is doing one thing and secular and mostly magistrates of public health that are advocating for an entirely different kind of response. And then I started reading the sources, and what I saw that this was entirely not the case.
Right.
I mean, like what I discovered that what I read in pretty old historiographical literature on Carlo Borromeo and the plague was that, and what I saw in the sources that there was no, there wasn't any sort of discord that historians have described, but rather a collaboration. And then I started thinking, okay, so that's interesting. First of all, I asked myself, why did historians in the past believe
Right.
that there was this sort of division in responses to plague? And then, what was the basis on which Borromeo and the civic authorities nevertheless collaborated in trying to minimize the impact of plague? And this is practically where my master thesis that then turned into this article started from trying to solve this historiographical question that just didn't fit to what I was seeing in the sources.
Yeah, and I think that divide that you draw and then the way you challenge that, as I said, that binary in the citation, I think is one of the most provocative things about this. And I guess one of the questions then is how singular that you think this is, right? Is this a specific instance in what's going on in Milan in the late 16th century, where Borromeo is sort of forging entirely new patterns about when he sort of collaborates with these professionals and when he challenges them? Or do you think he is endemic of a kind of larger patterns and there's this larger historiographic sort of creation of this binary distinction between medical knowledge and secular medical knowledge and religious knowledge when we approach understandings of disease and epidemic.
Yeah, so when I was speaking about those historians that are within, these are historians that wrote on Borromeo and the plague many decades ago,
Right.
but I, I received it with some wonder because recent historiography, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, have showed quite diligently that actually the distinction between the scientific or medical sphere and the religious world was not what we used to think about it in the past. And actually there was um, religious people and and lay practitioners, whether physicians or other sort of intellectuals, actually shared quite a lot of frameworks to understand the world. And particularly in relation to medicine, there's excellent and wonderful studies in the last couple of years that show, for example, how anatomy was used within processes of canonization. And Borromeo himself had gone through, after his death, had gone through a dissection by a physician trying to determine whether his body demonstrated signs of sanctity, which come to show how actually the things like medicine and religion were codependent and how they enforced one another. We have other wonderful studies on censorship, for example. And this study by my current advisor, how censors used how basically censored needed to censor Protestant writers mostly, but how they did it with a commitment both to their Catholic religion, but also to their professional identification as physicians who nevertheless wanted to advance knowledge, and how by censoring they in sort of negotiated the sort of creation of Catholic knowledge. And we have many examples of
Right.
that sort. So I believe that Borromeo's instance of using medical concepts in order to advance his religious program is not unusual in the period, and actually, not only that it's not unusual, other studies have shown that in times of plague we see much more collaboration between different sort of frameworks, both in relation to medical ideas and public health practices and religious thought than a division. But maybe
Right.
it's important to say what was this imagined division when it comes to plague in the first place, because
Sure.
maybe
Yeah, we
so.
can start off with that. And then I'd like to drill down into some of those. I have questions about some of those frameworks too. But yeah, but so
Okay,
can we talk about like what that division was or
yeah,
imagined division was?
okay, just very, very quickly, like scholars have told us for many decades that there have been three groups who held three social groups or professional groups who held different ideas about what was the cause of plague and what should be done against plague. So first there were physicians who we were told were believed that plague was a divine punishment
Yeah,
on humanity's sins, and therefore it was not a matter of contagion. It was um, something that God inflicted upon the people, and the only way to deal with it was through measures of penance and repentance, and mostly we are told through public processions to
right,
appease God's wrath. And then we have the health magistrates of the Italian cities, those people that managed public health response with and by the 16th century had developed a pretty elaborate system of creating separations between healthy and sick, between infected towns and still healthy towns. And these people believed that plague was contagious. And therefore, the most important thing to do was to create barriers between different sectors of society or between different geographical zones to protect their own city from infection. And then there were also physicians that held to Galenic Hippocratic ideas that disease and that the plague and any disease um, emerge from bad miasmas. So from
right.
these like, and there are different theories what exactly it was, but let's say different um, substances in the air or in food or in water that carry with them the disease. So and then in this regard, contagion, like separating people or separating between different groups of people also didn't make much sense, because if plague is in the air around us, it doesn't
Right.
make it makes no impact. So this is like this sort of like scheme that we have that we've had for many years. And what recent studies shows, and also my article, is that it just doesn't work. Definitely not when we come into the 16th century. And basically, Italians by the 16th century had come to accept the idea that plague was contagious. That is to say that plague could be spread through infected people or infected objects. By the way, it could be
Right.
wool, it could be wheat, it could be basically anything. Um, and therefore, by the 16th century, Italian society predominantly it came to develop those systems of creating separations between different geographical regions or between different parts of the city if a city
Right.
became infected, to prevent the further spread of plague. And what I show in my article, and we can speak about it more, is that Borromeo capitalized on these practices. He used these sort of practices of isolation and confinement as part of his as part of his religious
Yep.
understanding of what plague was, and as part of his political program, what society should be.
Yeah, and so that's actually that's a perfect segue into like what I wanted to follow up on. You look at this idea of purification that runs across both these kind of religious and medical programs, right? And we can talk about purification, right, as a way to both, right, cleanse the body and keep the body healthy, but also a kind of moral purification that motivates Borromeo in his religious program. So, yeah, could you talk a little bit more about sort of the notion of purification and how it sort of brings these to, or perhaps three paradigms together?
Yeah. Um, one of my sources of inspiration, or one of the studies that I rely on the most, is a relatively recent interpretation of the Reformation by Nicholas Terpstra. Basically, Terpstra shows the extent to which early modern society, in different geographical contexts, um, um, showed a concern for the purity of society, or the social body. And the ways to protect the body passed through measures of separation, isolation, confinement. Now, in Italy, in Carlo Borromeo's Italy, those practices meant, for example, either waging war on the Ottomans to prevent the influence of a Muslim religion, or closing Jews in ghettos to protect Christian society from the threat of Judaism, or on the contrary, isolating nuns in their convents in order to protect them from the impurity of society. So we have like all these um, different practices of isolation that have pretty much the same goal, protecting the purity of a certain social group. And what I show in my article is how Borromeo is using exactly that kind of reasoning to advance and justify the public health measures of confinement and separation. And now, what I'm trying to say is not that Borromeo, I would say, like, advance his religious program. What I'm saying is that his religious program was entwined and inseparable from the medical ideas that
Right.
necessitated separation. So what I'm trying to say is not that we have a politicization in this sort of like in a conscious necessarily way, but just like the two frameworks, these two, let's say, systems of thought um, emerged um, or let's say codependent, or they developed together into one important framework of thinking, both about social purification and the response to disease.
Right, and they sort of reinforce each other,
Yeah,
right, in
absolutely.
that
Yes.
way. One of the other things that most struck me, right, we talked about this moment where they reinforce each other, but where a moment of disjunction, and maybe this is because I have a number of students I'm working with who are doing research on religious understanding of touch. So you have this whole section on touch that I found incredibly compelling, right? And just as this notion of purity shows a kind of overlap of paradigms when we reinforce each other, when it comes to like the role of touch in spiritual and medical care, right? This is again this sort of giant disjunction. So yeah, can you
Yeah,
explain that to
absolutely.
yeah.
I'm happy you asked about it, because this is my favorite part of the
It's the
article.
best part of the article. It's great.
And yeah, so Borromeo is relying on isolation and separation as a religious and medical practice, right? But he also is an archbishop, and he needs to direct his clergymen to attend to the needs of his believers. And attending to the needs of the believers requires being in close contact with
Yep.
them, and also to touch them, because if you want to actually perform the sacraments, you have to touch the believers, right? And then, in a way, there's this dilemma. What do you do? And Borromeo tries to protect his clergy from the dangers of contagion as much as possible. For example, he instructs them to use vinegar to purify their hands, and to wear certain robes, and for example, hear confessions from a different side of the door, so they would not get exposed to the breath of sick people. But there's only a certain extent to which you can protect them from contagion, because you must have them touching
Right.
and creating those channels of affinity with um, with the believers. And then what he do? invokes this idea of Christ the physician,
Mhm.
right? And basically through the example of Christ, but also through the example of many other saints, he incites them to touch um, the sick or touch the believer, even with the possibility of losing their life. He basically prepares them for the possibility that they would be martyrs for the sake of serving the church and the believers in the time of plague. And and he does that mostly, he directs these efforts mostly towards the clergy. But interestingly, he does that also in relation to um, secular caregivers and mostly physicians. Now, what happened in Milan, and it's not only in Milan, it's a current theme in histories of plague, is that physicians, when plague enters a city, disappear, right? Like most of them, and um, either flee or stop executing their profession, and that happens also in Milan. And we have evidence of people from the governor to other commentators that harshly and bitterly criticize physicians for their dereliction of duty during the plague. And Borromeo is also trying to convince physicians, like he did for the clergy, to touch the patient. And his way of doing that is mostly by um, coming up with indulgences meant to persuade people to touch the patient. And he uses the word touch often in his um, um, while he's preaching in his text and also in these indulgences. He's really trying to use the word touch to push caregivers to do their job and provide care to the people that need it in time of plague. Now, what I see here is um, is a proof that Borromeo's use of medical concepts and medical practices during the plague um, was quite complicated because on the one hand he's using practices of separation and advancing them, but on the other hand he's also using an entirely different vector. I like to think it's all like vectors. So it's a vector that pushes ecclesiastics and physicians towards the believers. Um, and I think that's also like an important intervention in the way we understand the Catholic Reformation in general,
Yes.
and specifically people like Borromeo, because we tend to think about Borromeo and people and reformers like him as people that tried to enforce pretty strict um, social discipline and social um, sort of like boundaries, but a significant aspect of the Catholic Reformation was also creating channels through which clergymen could come into contact with the believer. So we're speaking either about missions or about different confraternities that were meant to teach and instruct the poor. And we can see the same thing happening with regards to touch in Borromeo's Milan. In those touch with religious signification, and therefore he hopes that people would follow through and would start also touching the sick whenever needed.
Do we have any evidence on how successful he is with this paradigm in changing any kind of behavior or sort of shaming these physicians into adopting the kind of strategies and establishing this kind of proximity with their patient? Uh,
So we know that he was successful with clergymen, or
right.
there's evidence written by clergymen
That,
about the success these models had within the clergy. So, they're
right.
testifying about themselves. But I think that, that they are pretty reliable
Yeah.
in testimonies as far as it goes to the church. I haven't seen. I would be very happy to find any indication of a physician that saw Borromeo's enticement and decided, oh, I'm going to serve now in the among the plague ridden. We do know that at least 30 physicians, if I'm not mistaken, served during the plague.
Okay.
In a city like Milan, it's a pretty
That's a
significant
big number.
number. And I don't know what their motivations was, and also I don't know what kind of practice they had with the physicians, but being appointment to the different neighborhoods. Um, what we do know is that one very important clergyman, Paolo Bellintani, he was a Capuchin friar, and he was appointed by Borromeo and the civic authorities to to preside over Milan's plague hospital, the Lazaretto. And he was a pretty pious man, and he wrote between 1584 and 1590 a really fantastic book that's called Dialogo della Peste, the dialogue on the plague, that circulated only in manuscript and was, I think maybe a couple of years ago, was published in a modern and scientific edition. And Paolo Bellintani uses Borromeo's language of touch to criticize
Right.
physician even further. And what I show in the article is that he's basically telling physicians that they are incapable of truly diagnosing plague and truly treating plague because they are too afraid to touch their patients. So Bellintani takes Borromeo's religious ideas about what medical care should look like during plague, during time in times of plague, and he uses it as a way to criticize physicians' conduct and paint himself as someone, although he was not a doctor, but he paints himself as someone who is capable of providing medical care, not religious care, medical
Right.
care, much better than they. But it gets even more interesting because if you look at what's happening in the medical sphere around the same time, not in times of plague, but
Right. Just in general.
yeah, in general. So if you look at it, you see that physicians themselves are starting to criticize their own practices in regards to their hand labor. So it is pretty common to say that there are exceptions to it, but it's common to think about the medical profession in the Middle Ages and the early modernity,
Yeah.
and, as a profession that was pretty averse to using manual labor. Now
Yeah.
there are intellectual reasons to it, and it comes to the formation of medicine as an academic profession. But basically, physicians were not touching their patients like it's common today when you go to see a physician. And and criticism of that practice is starting to be heard around the 15th and 16th
Right.
century. One of the most important people to do it is one of the first important groups are anatomists who
Right.
start saying, we must start touching corpses to understand how
Of
the human
course.
body functions. But it's not only anatomists, it's also clinicians that say, we must use palpation to understand our patients' bodies, or we must actually observe them to be able to provide thick descriptions of of the course of their illness, so we can actually understand what their illness was about. So all these things are happening, and I think that Bellintani, in a way, internalized this criticism that came out of the medical profession, and he's looking around in a way saying, you say that it doesn't say it like this, but I think that basically what his words are conveying is that physicians are saying, it's really important to touch patients, but
Right.
when plague is around, all of them all of a sudden disappear. So he's using the criticism that physicians have already
Used of
developed,
them themselves, right?
yeah, exactly, against
That's
themselves, connects it to Borromeo's ideas of the religious importance of touch, and that really gives him the authority in a way to paint himself as the most capable medical practitioner in Milan during the month of plague.
so like that's a great example of right the way you're using some of these like recently published manuscripts. Can you talk a little bit about the archival work that you did here? especially for people who haven't spent time in those archives, and what were some of those important things that you found, or exciting things that you found, or things that sort of shifted how you understand this story?
Yeah, so one of the most important archival collection that I use was archival collection of plague bans that was issued in Milan during the plague. It's preserved in the Biblioteca Brandense in Milan. It's like a lovely, beautiful library, and these are mostly printed plague bans. Now, for those of you who haven't, for those who haven't seen a plague ban ever, it's probably one of the most important printed um, document that we have from plague outbreaks because it was quite common to print one almost every day, even several a day sometimes, with different instruction of what's needed to be done, and they were hang around the
Oh,
city. So we have these like big folios, and normally it's hanging around the city, and those in the Biblioteca Bledense have not obviously been hanging around, but they were used and probably they were they were collected in a way that would allow their future consultation um, to create this sort of basis of knowledge on plague for future epidemics. Now that's one collection that I used, and another collection was um, Borromeo's letters preserved in the
oh,
Biblioteca
yeah,
Ecclesiastica. Now, I actually haven't seen them in person because they are digitized, but
right.
the surprising thing is that I actually didn't. I at first I hadn't looked at them because the first part of my article, where I am showing how Borromeo and the civic authorities collaborated, was not there at first. So I submitted the article for first consideration without that part,
Oh,
and I relied on the work of Samuel Cohen,
right.
who shows based on printed sources that there had been mostly collaboration between the religious and
Right.
civic authorities. And then the reviewers and maybe this is the place to say how grateful I am for the reviews because true like the reviews were pretty harsh, but they also made the article
Pushed
much
you.
better.
Right.
Yeah. So they told me, this is really not proven. There's all this historiography showing that there was a conflict that there was a conflict between Borromeo and Deco. You need to show that this
Right.
was not the case. And then I dived into Borromeo's letters, and I found incredible stuff, I think. So I found a letter, for example, that he writes to the governor after one of the big penis processions, and basically sharing with the governor this sort of religious, very strong religious feelings about the successful and about the beautiful event that both of them participated in. And I think this is an important contribution to show exactly how the people that lived in the society, both on the secular world and the religious world, were participating in the same religious
Right.
efforts um, to confront the plague in different ways. So yeah, these were mostly the two important archival um, um, collections I used, and other than that, there were many published
Right.
sources, 16th century published
But
sources that
those are fabulous sources. I mostly do my work on the like 11th and 12th century, so I always get jealous. You get those kind of daily accounts like that. Those sound amazing. Um, can you tell us more about where you want to take this work, or if you see this work fitting into the what you're doing now with the dissertation, or if this is something you're putting aside for a little while while you finish the dissertation, and like how does Borromeo fit into?
it doesn't really fit in. But I think that what I was very interested when I was working on Borromeo was the relationship between medicine and politics. And when I say politics, I mean politics. Also church reforms are politics.
Right. Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
yeah. So I think that now my current work shows how physicians are using historical research to investigate epidemic diseases. So we're still in the context of epidemic diseases, and I write quite a lot
Right.
on plague in the 17th in the 18th century. And what I currently show is that physicians used historical research to situate themselves as political actors
Mhm.
and to advance political reforms of public health and the environment. So some of this sort of work that I've been doing on Borromeo, trying to connect intellectual ideas in this sort of like intellectual history
Right.
framework with political actions. So it's something that I'm still pretty fascinated by. And so that's my current project. But then I do have a dreamy book that I would like to write one day that deals with the way Italian society over a long period of time um, used ideas about disease to control its own borders. So basically, how what the relationship between sanitary border control and between sanitary practices and border control dictated the way the Italian states were formed throughout the early modern period and maybe even into the 19th century. And because some of these organizations of public health persisted into the 19th century.
Right. Well, so I mean, that's fascinating because, like,
And it's one of these.
well, I think you can see those impulses and directions in this article. Like, you open the article with, and I apologize, I haven't been quoting for it, but I think I just need to here because you start with this very, I think, what I found provocative line, which is outbreaks of epidemic provide fertile ground for the propagation of ideologies and the enforcement of political authority. Right. So, like, that's this broad statement and broad invitation to think not about sort of political authority and its relationship with disease in this particular moment, but to think sort of transhistorically about how the the way in which moments of epidemic um, can shape all kinds of like political action. So you're talking about here in Italy. I didn't know how broad you wanted to go on this, right? Or
Yeah,
not
and
to
it
be a
was so
presentist, but like that has ramifications for the current moment as well.
absolutely. By the way, this sentence, I remember when I wrote it, and it was in the midst of the COVID
Of course.
pandemic. So those things reflect. And when I was completing my master thesis, Italians were singing from their balconies, which is pretty much what Italians did in the 16th century when they prayed together from the balconies. So
Oh,
there are all these sort
wow.
of similarities that I found and I still find really fascinating. And this is one of the reasons why I'm drawn um, to epidemics throughout different periods.
Um, I was told that we have to keep this to half an hour and we've already gone by. This has been a fascinating conversation. Like thank you so much for this. I encourage everyone to go back and read the article again, Public Health, Medicine and Religious Reform and uh, Borromeo's Milan. Um, by Ori Ben Shalom. Thank you so much for this.
No, thank you for having me. It was great to
Yeah,
get to talk.
I hope we get to talk more soon.